In chapter 2858, Kiera and her mother delve into a conversation that uncovers deeper layers of their perceptions of Julian. Kiera initially defends Julian, asserting that although he is a businessman, he is not solely defined by his business acumen. She acknowledges that everyone has their own secrets and that Julian is no exception. Mrs. Karen counters with a more skeptical view, recalling how Julian initially pretended not to know martial arts when they first met. She suggests that Julian might have orchestrated the entire encounter to position himself as Kiera's savior, thereby gaining her trust and affection. This speculation is fueled by the improbability of encountering so many gangsters in a well policed city like Wilspoon, leading her to suspect that Julian might have arranged the incident. Kiera dismisses her mother's theory as far fetched, attributing it to an overconsumption of TV dramas. She argues that their family's lack of immense wealth makes them unlikely targets for his machinations. She recalls the night she saved Julian as their first meeting, emphasizing the unlikelihood of him plotting against her from the start. Given his substantial business interests and the possibility of business rivals seeking to harm him, she finds it more plausible that the gangsters were genuine threats rather than part of a grand scheme. Mrs. Karen's concerns extend beyond the incident, pointing out Kiera's tendency to see the best in people. She expresses worry that Kiera's trusting nature makes her naive in social interactions, particularly with someone like Julian, an unmarried older man. Mrs. Karen believes Julian's interest in Kiera stems from romantic feelings and plans to make her his partner. She chastises Kiera for her obliviousness, attributing her lack of success on blind dates on this same naivety. Despite her criticism, Mrs. Karen acknowledges that Julian's affection is fortunate, sparing Kiera from a life of dependence on her brothers. Kiera's indignation grows as her mother's words hit a nerve, especially when Mrs. Karen bluntly points out her failures in blind dating. Despite this, she realizes that her mother has long recognized Julian's interest in her. This revelation leads Kiera to reflect on the family's changing dynamics, noting that they have grown more casual and accepting of Julian. Mrs. Karen, who now regards Julian as a prospective son in law, speaks freely about him, much like she does with other family members. Kiera's previous concerns about her mother's nagging towards Julian resurface. She had privately reassured Julian not to take Mrs. Karen's words to heart, understanding her mother's nature. Now, with the realization that her family has been subtly supportive of his presence, she feels a mix of embarrassment and enlightenment. She perceives herself as having been the most oblivious in the situation, likening herself to a monkey being tricked. Mrs. Karen's curiosity about Kiera's newfound awareness prompts her to ask how she discovered Julian's feelings. She is intrigued, as she initially viewed Kiera as somewhat oblivious to romantic signals, especially from someone like Julian. Kiera's response remains unspoken, but it is clear that her mother's insights and the gradual realization of Julian's consistent kindness and care have contributed to her understanding. The chapter concludes with Kiera in a contemplative state, grappling with her mother's revelations and her own evolving feelings towards Julian. The conversation with Mrs. Karen has opened her eyes to the possibility that Julian's intentions might be deeper and more genuine than she initially thought. As she processes this, she begins to see Julian not just as a friend, but as a potential partner, guided by her family's subtle but consistent acceptance and encouragement.